There we are. There was a signal. Well, welcome everybody. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Hakan Altinay, who is a visiting fellow academic visitor of our great program on Southeastern Europe, CSOX. He is longtime director of the European School of Politics in Istanbul. The adjective is still optimistic, where many of us have had the pleasure of speaking. He's a professor of practice at Tufts University in Boston, has been a senior fellow at Brookings. His books include Global Civics, Responsibilities and Rights in an Interdependent World, and a book called Medeni Civic, published in Turkey in 2023. He is also, and this is perhaps unusual among our list of speakers, someone who spent more than a year as a political prisoner in...
Nobody's perfect.
Prison. That makes him more perfect. That's perfect. As one of very many political prisoners, it has to be said, in Erdogan's Turkey. He was in the Osman Kavala trial. Osman Kavala and many others are, of course, still in prison, and so we think of them as we have this really enjoyable, I hope, conversation on the magic of conversation. And it's great to have as respondent our own Paul Betts. I'm not going to say he needs no introduction, because then people always give an introduction. So I'm going to introduce him. He's our professor of modern European history, a great expert on Germany, particularly East Germany. Wrote a wonderful book, most recently, Ruin and Renewal, Civilizing Europe After World War II, which won the Jacques Bazin Prize, and is now working on what sounds like a fascinating book on, if I've understood it right, the transformation of Central and Eastern Europe after 1989, which we're very much looking forward to, Paul. I should also just say that every conversation needs a woman, at least one woman, and you will notice that there is none on this panel. So an apology in advance, but this was not for want of trying, because we tried quite hard to find someone. And eventually our colleague Catherine Riddick said, listen, it's much better not just to have a woman as pure tokenism, if there isn't someone who's really qualified for the conversation. So take this as one conversation in which there's a perfect gender balance in this one. So Hakan will talk for about 30-35 minutes, Paul will respond, and then we will go into the conversation. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a true pleasure to be here and to chase answers to questions that I care deeply about with colleagues and friends that I respect a great deal, as well as friends to be. So my proposal is to have a thought experiment. If we had a time machine and could go back to December of 1999, and if we had a way of auditing collective worries of mankind, I think we'll probably find that we were most worried about the Y2K bug. Some of us are old enough to remember this. We were worried that because someone made a decision several decades ago to restrict digit size to 2 for years, when we went from 99 to 00 for year 2000, somehow our New Year's party would be spoiled. Other than that, we thought we were in a great place. Right? We were about to establish the first international criminal court. All major disagreements seemed to have been solved. There was no more the danger of a nuclear holocaust. WTO and the norms that it represented were thought to be unproblematic and almost boring. Right? We all believe that more or less everyone will turn out to be a Chardonnay sipping moderates, one way or another at one time or another. Now, we now know this is not how things turned out, and we tend to attribute a lot to President Trump. The bright sun washes out a lot of details. But let me list a few developments that happened in the last 10 years, which I don't think can be explained by Trump alone. For those of you who are Netflix fans, you may have watched House of Cards. the first serial that made Netflix a household name.
Really serious, actually.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. How about that?
And then the American sequel,
Oh,
spin-off of the British.
didn't know that. As you know, nowadays it's very well versed
BBC.
in everything. But in House of Cards, there's a president called President Underwood, the mischievous character. He's actually murderous. He's not a person that you think you would invite to dinner. Yet polls showed him to be more popular than President Obama. It is possible. Obama was supposed to be our Marcus Aurelius, wise man, very sensible, and yet a feral character like President Obama outpolls President Underwood outpolls President Obama. Or think about the COVID pandemic. Research showed that significant pluralities in the US held Bill Gates responsible. Now, nobody has to like Bill Gates, the way he makes money or the way he spends money, but to hold someone that through his deeds and through his words have been warning the world about a pandemic is at least strange and begs an explanation. Or we could recall that a US Secretary of Defense, when asked what kept him up at night, did not say China or ISIS or Russia. He said internal divisions in the US. This too is strange. I mean, he is the secretary that has hundreds of billions of dollars worth of hardware to deliver security, but he's worried about something that his hardware cannot solve. So I think these, and if you like, I can give some examples from Europe, but in the interest of time, let me skip that. What should we make of these developments and the fact that we couldn't foresee them? What does this say about our radar and sonar and our models and our concepts? I would make 4 broad claims. I would say one problem is that we forgot that the French Revolution had 3 and not 2 mottos. Clearly, liberty is important, clearly, equality is important, but so is fraternity. In the interest of being not so retrograde in terms of gender, let's call it camaraderie for the time being. Interesting word, camaraderie. Etymologically, comes from camera, the Latin word for space or room. So camaraderie is what we do, what we have when we share a common space. But do we share that common space? Do we live together? And more importantly, do we know together? There has been this concept of big sorting, which showed that as late as 1979, only 26% of US districts were slam dunk districts. That number is now 60%. By Pew's counting, only 8% of the districts are called bipartisan. So at least in terms of political affiliation, we no longer live together. John Yates did a similar projection for the UK and found out that if you have an advanced degree, you would need to invite 100 people to your party, your welcome to summer party, to have one unemployed person. Fairly stark. So we don't live together, we don't face similar predicaments, and sadly, we don't even know together. Now, conscience, the term, etymologically, I'll keep on making this argument, on science, is knowing together. Okay? You may recall Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, how we sat in one room and we sit in our chair in the morning, open the Times of London, and we would know that other people would be sitting in similar chairs and reading the Times of London, and we would read the same things. We would know together. First, satellite transmission and then social media has ensured that we no longer know together. It is a completely balkanized, fractured sphere of knowing. And of course, some of this automatic, and some of this is someone manipulating us. If you listen to the testimonials of the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, he talked about how they whispered something different to everyone's ear as a way of changing the society. You break the society before you change it. It was a malign design, and we don't have any evidence that it did not work. Now, David Goodhart talks about this as somewhere people and anywhere people. This will be the anywhere people. Scholastically successful, with mobile degrees and mobile careers. Their sense of worth, our sense of worth, is that we can be in Istanbul one day, in Oxford the next day, and in Hong Kong or Delhi the other day. This is how we define ourselves. Somewhere people, their identity is largely a function of where they live and which local investments they make, and are they a good civic member of their communities. There is a tension, we have to admit this. The anywhere people has more superficial local allegiances, and somewhere people know this. There is also a lot of disdain that goes from anywheres to somewheres. David Goodhart argues that he has written this book to correct a bit of this and rehabilitate the esteem and the virtue of the somewhere limit. University of Chicago research shows that we are under-social. This is an interesting research where they stand in front of the suburban train taking people into Chicago, give everyone a gift card from Starbucks for $5, and the survey has two questions. The group is randomly divided into three. Do exactly what you did the day before. Is what the instruction for one group. The instruction for the other group is be more social than you would be otherwise. And the third group is be less social than you would be otherwise. And only two questions. As you board the train, how do you think this would work? And B, when you get off the train, how did it work? So it turns out that everyone nudged to be more social, thought this would be terrible, but it ended up being great. So the researcher concludes that we actually, if just nudged gently, we would enjoy this. A related research from Harvard says we exaggerate how unreasonable our political rivals are, the other tribe. We find the most outrageous thing they say and keep on repeating it to convince ourselves that they are actually morally reprehensible and therefore not need our attention. So a question could be asked, is there a causal link? Do we dislike our opponents because we have subpar, too few engagements with them? Let me pause it for the time being that I think we have discovered that without camaraderie, there's a low ceiling to how much we can achieve in terms of liberty and equality. Now, related to our neglect of camaraderie, I would say is our neglect and underestimation of the importance of goodwill and trust. Let's take something as basic as how we greet each other. I don't know if we have thought about this, but as we came in this afternoon, we shook hands, right? Where did this convention come from? Who were the first people to shake hands, and why did they shake hands? It turns out that it was the ancient Greeks who were the first people that were shaking hands, and it had functional rationale. It was to show that I was bearing no knives. I could approach you without threatening you. Military salute is the same. I have no spear, so I do it from a distance so you can approach me without fearing me. Abrahamic faiths say the way that Abrahamic faiths greet each other have the same grammar. Pax vobis, shalom aleichem, aleikum salam, they all mean I come in peace. Salvasia, namaste, right? I revere the divinity in you, immediately reciprocated, of course. It's not that I revere the divinity in you and you don't. A fight will break out. There are poetic ways of greeting. In South Africa, for example, you say sawubona, which means I see you. Interesting. If I'm greeting you, I must have seen you, right? But I think when they say I see you, it means I see you as a peer, as a bearer of rights and esteem. Maybe the most poetic is among the Mayas in Central America. They say, I am another you, underlining again parity and interrelatedness. Now, why is this? Why is different cultures, different geographies, different time periods choose to greet the same way? Jared Diamond has one answer in the book The World Till Yesterday, arguing that way back when we were living in tribes, there were friends, there were enemies, and there were strangers. And in all likelihood, strangers were enemies, because there was no benign reason for a stranger to come near you. They were either there to kill you or steal something, so you had to assume that the stranger was an enemy. But as we evolved into more complicated structures, we could not afford to treat every stranger as an enemy, and we had to find ways to create a relationship of goodwill, to denounce violence, and to form parity. The difficult conversation lab at Columbia University, through research, showed that unless your criticism is preceded by 3 positive messages, I heed not your criticism. Apparently, in romantic relationships, the relationship is 5-1. Expectations are higher. The onus for establishing goodwill is high. We can look at Confucius, another source of perennial wisdom. His students ask him, what is the 3 most vital things for a thriving community? He says, food, security, trust. Smart students, they don't relent. They say, what if you need to give up 2? What is the one thing that you would not give up? He thinks a little and answers trust. Rationale being, if there is trust in that community, we can resupply food and resupply security. But if there is no trust, we can't do either. RSA, the Royal Society for the Advancement of Arts in London, has new papers establishing that trust is the most correlated factor with all kinds of socioeconomic, sociocultural things that we want to do. You can say this is soft. This is not. This doesn't explain our world. That good guys finish last. Milton Friedman told us that greed was good and legitimate. But I would say research doesn't prove this. Robert Axelrod, former president of the American Political Science Association, wrote a very interesting book called Evolution of Cooperation. Try to find reasons for cooperation without a state, without a Leviathan, and where there were only egoists. Okay, so prisoner's dilemma. Some of you may be familiar with this. Basically, we are dependent on each other's actions. The wisest thing would be to cooperate with each other. But if you also don't want to be a sucker, if the other party cooperates with the police, then you say you get a stiff jail sentence. He invites all kinds of programmers and says, come up with a strategy that will perform the best. Again, because we are told to be selfish and maximalist at all times. So this tournament takes place between all kinds of simulations. The scenario that wins is start by being a nice guy and reciprocate what your opponent does. So if your opponent turns out to be a good guy, you keep on cooperating and you reap all the benefits of being nice. He redoes the tournament in 2 years' time. Everyone knows the simple and decent strategy that won, and you would think, with all the advice that we are getting from everyone else, that there would be a way to outperform by being cunning and by no, doesn't happen. So being decent, and I would even say being generous, is not stupid. It's in fact quite rational. I think it also proves that we can't run a society purely on transactions. We need some other North Stars to mindful of. Now, my third point is that we have been too unwilling to recognize that we are interdependent, and we have valorized independence. From George Nisbet's book, Geography of Thought, to more recent book by Joseph Heinrich, The Weirdest People in the World, there is now abundance of empirical narratives on the individualistic, atomistic understanding of us. Yet, someone like Yuval Harari in his book, The Sapiens, I think convincingly argues that we are not here in the world because we compete the West, but we are here because we cooperate the West. We have many varied modes of cooperating, and we cooperate with the largest number of our peers. We don't jump the highest, we don't run the fastest, but we run the world because we cooperate the best. Now, there is one research that I think supports Harari's arguments, and that is the ultimatum game. Some of you may have heard this. An experiment that has been done around the world for now 30 years. You are walking down the main street of wherever you live. Someone stops you. He or she stops another person walking on the street. So you are three of you in the middle of the street. This person pulls out 100 euros from their wallet, gives it to you, and say, decide the way you want to split this money with this person. No bargaining, no communication. You don't know each other, and you, in all likelihood, will not see each other again. So, how would you behave? Now, if you believe in Homo economicus, what would you do? They tell you to be maximalist, maximize your personal gain. Now, you can't quite do 100 to 0, because the other person would say no. But the other person has only two options. They either say yes, so you get the money that you decided, or the other person says no, and neither of you get anything, right? But you could do, and in fact, you should do 99 to 1, because Homo economicus tells you to hoard as much as you can. That is legitimate, and this is in fact how the welfare of the society will be maximized. And you would only need to give €1 to the second person, and the second person would say yes to this because he or she is only in it to hoard the maximum. And he or she now has €1 that he or she didn't have a moment ago, right? But this is not how any of the societies around the world behave. Again, as I said, this has been done for 30 years around the world. The split everywhere is 55 to 45. So why are these people giving €45 and they should only give €1? Could it be that they care about fairness? We also know from research that offers worse than 75 to 25 are routinely rejected by the second person. So the second person is willing to pay a personal price to defend fairness. Where is this in our understanding of who we are and where we are? Another survey. World Public Opinion Survey. You ask people whether you should obey international law all the time, or in cases where your government doesn't think it's in the national interest, should they have an opt-out? 53% of the people in the world, 22 countries representing 90% of world population, say, obey international law even when my government doesn't want it. Extraordinary results. Even more interesting, you go to that 53% and ask them whether they're a minority in their own society or a majority. They say, oh, we are a minority. While they are not only a majority in their own country, they're a majority in the world. For every decent Brit, there's a decent Brazilian. For every decent German, there's a decent Indonesian. But we have not created the forum, we have not provided the language for them to discover their decency. if we are interdependent, how should we live in this world? Agape is one name that comes to mind. Goodwill, the word that the Bible used. The word that Martin Luther King used. Again, you may think that this is stuff for poets and their embellishments, but Martin Luther King couldn't do without agape, and Desmond Tutu couldn't do without Ubuntu when he was establishing the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. We also need to live responsibly, etymologically coming from response. Response that we owe a response to our peers. Okay? Gandhi talked about this, Atatürk talked about this, and John Adams talked about this. He said, our constitution was made only for a virtuous people. It is wholly inadequate to government of any other. Benjamin Franklin, when he received a request from Benjamin Webb for some money, he thinks for 2 days, sends a check with the money, says this is not a grant but a loan, not to be repaid to me, but to be paid to someone in equal distress in the future, with the same instructions. Starting a chain of paying forward, and arguing that if this new society they are establishing is indeed a decent one and deserves to live, this chain will not be broken. Now, Walter Isaacson managed to write a very thick book on as a biography of Benjamin Franklin, and chose not to include this. Why is that? I think part of the problem is the genealogy that we tell to each other about who we are and where we came from. The classical, canonical narrative for this is the Plato to NATO courses in elite US universities. Starts with Plato talking about Socrates, of course, the first martyr to good causes, goes through the Middle Ages, as Dark Ages. Nobody ever hears of someone like Plotinus, for example. We get to Renaissance, which sort of send our shackles off. We do discoveries, we get bounties, Hobbes, Adam Smith, Darwin. We get to Atlantic Charter, which sort of finalizes what all right-thinking people. This meta-narrative is problematic not only because of what it includes, but it also what it omits. We learn about Magna Carta, Libertatum, but we don't learn about the Charter of the Forest, which is about managing our commons as peers, and the Allemansratten that all the Nordic societies still to this day have, that even in private property, you can go and roam, you can collect berries, you can even camp there. The Norwegian royal family lives in a house, like a palace, with no fences. You can walk up to their door and ring the bell. There's one guard standing there. This is certainly not part of our Plato to NATO narrative. We talk about Descartes, but not Spinoza. We talk about Adam Smith, but not Thomas Paine, which in the Agrarian Justice book said, unless we make a civilizational shift, the political revolutions we did in France and in the US will not be complete and will not be perfect. He talked about giving grants to people when they turned 21, something we call now the universal basic capital, not universal basic income. Milton Friedman, we talk about, but another Nobel laureate, Eleanor Ostrom, we don't talk about. So the standard genealogy is not only subpar, but I think it does injustice to both our past and also our future. Now, let's assume that I'm not completely off, and we have indeed ignored the importance of camaraderie, goodwill, trust. We have valorized independence too much at the expense of interdependence and what it takes to manage interdependence. And that we have pasteurized our language and our genealogy. What is the one thing that we should do? And I would say if I could have a Christmas wish list with one item, that would be to rehabilitate the status of listening well and the status of a good conversation. Thanks to Tim guidance, I discovered that Erasmus, instead of in the beginning was the Word and the Word was God, translated that in the beginning was a conversation. Theodore Zeldin of this college wrote a book, I have a copy, in 1998, where he describes a conversation. The telltale sign of a conversation is to include at least the theoretical possibility of changing. Etymologically, conversation means changing together, not converging. But I need to have an ability to reach Paul, and Paul has to have an ability, at least the theoretical possibility, of seeping into me. Without this, there is no conversation. Without that, what we have is a debate. We are finished products when we start, and there is no change, there is no possibility of meaningful interaction. Now, corollary to a good conversation is listening, but listening well. Various traditions, Benedictine tradition, Sufis, Taoists have described this as listening with your heart's ear. It's interesting. Why heart's ear, right? And I think what they were trying to say is that listening is not an automatic affair. It's something done with our ear. It has something to do with your intention. Are you listening to respond? Okay? Or are you listening to understand? And sadly, no one teaches us how to listen. Everyone teaches us how to talk. Talk like Ted. This is a book. Or we have apps to do killer applications, and we have public speaking courses, but we don't have listening. Now think about how many people are there trying to sell you something versus how many people are there to really listen to you, or how many people are there to get you as a partisan of one cause or another. I was talking with the senior manager of a big foundation that shall remain named, and she said they're working on depolarization, and she said, I couldn't even convince my own staff that this was important. Because they subscribe to the motto that in order to mobilize, you have to polarize. So why should I give up on polarization if I want a certain result? Right? And my quote to her was an MO. This said, never allow the public to cool off, never admit a fault, never concede that there may have been some good in your enemy, never leave room for an alternative. Can you guess where this MO is from? It's Hitler's rule book. I'm not saying everyone that does this is Hitler rules. But I think we have to be careful about the company that we keep. Now, clearly there have been others. For example, Kennedy, in his peace speech at the American University graduation, only 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, is extraordinarily generous to the Russians. And he says they paid a huge price to defeat National Socialism, that they were decent people, they wanted peace, and everyone was shocked, including the Soviets. Printed the speech in full next day, and within 6 months we have the first nuclear arms control treaty. So there are people who don't do this rule book. We talked about the Polish bishops writing to the German bishops. There are some Turks in the room. Our great friend Antony never subscribed to that rule book, and I think achieved extraordinary things only through magnanimity and only through the size of his art. Gingic, again, discussed with Dimo. Apparently, his instruction to his followers was, we will never succeed unless you see a man and not a police when you come across a policeman. This is a man that gave Milosevic the hate. Abraham Lincoln, apparently his rule of thumb was, I don't know this man, I don't like this man, I have to get to know him better. Okay? So there are clear choices here. These sort of people exist. My favorite description of them is from Maria Popova. It's so beautiful that I'm going to read it and not try to paraphrase it. She describes them as those who alchemize suffering and rage into love, who compost disappointment into fertilizer for growth, who break down cynicism to its building blocks of helplessness and hubris, and then metabolize the toxin out of the system we call society. Absolutely beautiful. These people do indeed exist, but can we just rely on them, or do others have some responsibility? My favorite would be the local governments. Local governments have to be in charge, have to take it on themselves to work with these type of people and to offer spaces where we taste, breathe, and savor camaraderie and the taste for good conversations and spaces for listening. We try something like this in Turkey. Some of you have been part of this project in the back, along with Dimitri has lectured in our school. We have an alumni as well, and we have done this for 10 years. It is deeply possible. In fact, it's so easy to do that I feel it should be a shame and a sin, if not a crime, not to do it. We know the costs are minimal, but the opportunity cost of not doing this, I think, is huge. So I'll stop here. I've spoken longer than I wanted to do. Some of this is in a paper. I have 2 copies of this here. If anyone wants a hard copy, they're also available at our website at the European School of Politics and at the Generous Listening and Dialogue Center at Tufts. You can download it.
It was a pleasure listening. And, I really appreciate the emphasis you put on listening. When I was doing my work on free speech, one of the most interesting things about the Indian tradition, a rich tradition of thinking about free speech, was that the focus is as much on the listener as on the speaker, whereas in the Western tradition, it's almost entirely on the speaker. So I'm looking forward to listening to Paul.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for such a kind of wide-ranging, stimulating paper. It was great to read, also just to hear you present it now. I'm not sure I'm the best qualified to give but I'm very, very happy to give some reflections, historical reflections on this particular problem. And it's also been a pleasure to have a number of conversations with you since you've been here. And I must say, a little did I know that these are both kind of an ethical imperative and primary source research in our conversation. So that's also very interesting for me to hear in terms of the power, the presence of conversations as a kind of building block of a better society. In your call for the kind of recovery of cooperation and camaraderie, I think it's very important because it goes to the very root and the condition of civil society itself, which makes this topic, to me, all the more relevant and kind of urgent, I think, for our particular fears. And I'll try to circle back to some of that in a few minutes. So I think what's important here, it's not just about the comportment of states and society, that goes right to the importance of interpersonal relations. And you provide us a kind of moral and kind of psychological dimension of citizenship. And as you say, the engagement with strangers is an important part of that. And in your talk, you also talk about the value of unpredictable and unscripted encounters as actually fundamental to this idea of a kind of mutual respect and mutual learning. You talk about the role of play, like the Huizinga, I think rightly as an important source, this effort to kind of challenge kind of means, ends, rationality with this idea of a kind of the things that's not rationalized, the elements that are surprising and unknown. I think you also give us a picture of kind of social life, at least in our moment, which is deformed, distorted, and then the importance of the role of trust, interdependence, and mutual respect. And I like Tim, I think it's very, very powerful to talk about the social and political significance of listening as, in a sense, the very, very foundation of that particular project. But when we think historically about, let's say, the power of conversation, I couldn't help with someone like Habermas. Of course, he has this idea of the theory of communicative action. And for him, that communication, that interaction, in a sense, it's about the enactment and the strengthening of democracy through public discussion. And it's the conflict over ideas, over ideology, is the lifeblood then of public life based on dialogue and debate. And so that way, I think these kind of lunchtime conversations, and we had one just yesterday, becomes then, in a sense, the kind of seedbed of political understanding and the will to change and improve. And I think you've made a very strong case to that. But of course, a lot of these roots go way back before 1999. You begin with the kind of Y2K issue. And I'm going to just sketch out a few things which I think are important historical precedents. This idea of the premium put on conversation, I think we associate with much earlier periods. In many ways, we think of the chatty or garrulous Renaissance and the Enlightenment in two ways. First, the idea of the Republic of Letters, which connects people over vast distances in remote conversations. And in these conversations, it's about the advancement of knowledge based on civility and exchange and knowledge production. I think that's important. The second one, I think you're right to talk about camaraderie as linked to the word camera, which is an idea of house or place. And it's also about the sites of interaction. I mean, for the Renaissance through the Enlightenment, those sites of sociability are, in a sense, the Masonic Lodge, the literary salon, and of course, the coffee house as important kind of spaces of Enlightenment get-togethers, in a sense, building particular ideas, often merchant ideas, but also ideas of science across different spheres. And in a sense, early on, we forget that the internet itself was seen as a kind of e-version of a kind of 18th century salon in its early days. I mean, how far we've kind of fallen from that particular ideal is quite remarkable. So you talked about today as a kind of moment of atrophy, isolation. And you mentioned early on the importance of the French Revolution. I think you're right to talk about that Holy Trinity, if you want to call it, the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. It's the last element that's often forgotten. And it reminded me of the book many of you probably know, written by the Cambridge historian David Reynolds. And it's a book called The World Divisible. It's a book about the Cold War itself. And he sets up this idea of the empire of liberty, being the United States, and the empire of equality, meaning the Soviet Union. It's exactly that idea of fraternity which dropped out of his particular estimation in terms of understanding the Cold War as a kind of superpower antagonistic moment. That, of course, I think is overdrawn because fraternity mattered a great deal at various moments, of course, in the 20th century. You can think of that at the level of international organizations. The League of Nations and the United Nations were seen as a place of building fraternal bonds of states. Now, both of those institutions are well known for their flaws and problems, including the defense of empire in both cases. But there was at least an effort to maintain communication, dialogue in the name of peace. And that was especially important after 1945. These international organizations become bridge institutions to keep those channels of dialogue open in a world of superpower isolation. Now, this is particularly important for a range of those UN spin-off organizations, UNESCO being probably the most important, with UNESCO's idea early on of a global society, and that all civilizations are equal, and that it's built on a world of peace and interaction. So I think many ways what you're talking about has been at the very heart of, let's say, the UNESCO mission in terms of the idea of bringing people from different continents together to talk across various religious, linguistic, and cultural divides to come up with what they often call an idea of humanity or global civilization. So I think UNESCO has been an important institution in trying to do the kind of work or a kind of intercontinental conversation that you've been talking about. When we think about the importance of fraternity in the 20th century, I think one key and of course well-known instance is 1968 itself, right? As the kind of moment in which West and Eastern European students from Berkeley to Boston, Paris to Prague. It's one in which was surprising to a number of authorities at the time, in which you had alienated youth, or at least the feeling of alienation in both blocks, a kind of sense in which young people felt deeply dissatisfied with this world of Cold War antagonism and the world they're going to inherit, where the earlier generations about the material reconstruction of the world for their children, that wasn't quite enough, and they were after different kinds of values. So in a sense, they were criticizing in both blocks, both Eastern and Western Europe, a kind of buttoned up top-down democracy, and they go to the barricades in the name of direct democracy, dialogue, and fraternity. It's one of their key phrases. Now, in that particular case, it's a story of generational solidarity across the globe in the name of anti-colonialism. But it's an effort to overcome what they felt in both sides, a kind of state monologue, a kind of party-centric view, in an effort to call for a more participatory democracy based on the importance of communication. Now, fast forward to where we are today. This is what is now called the kind of age of transactionalism, in a sense, a kind of classic term associated with Trump and the way he sees the world, where everything then is an exchange, is a transaction, a kind of zero-sum world in which it's about a kind of estate broker's view of world politics. For some, that's a kind of vulgarized Carl Schmitt, in that it's a world divided between friend and foe, one in which you have a natural suspicion then towards strangers, which are most likely your enemies and probably not your friends. So in a sense, what Schmitt was talking about for kind of political theory has become, sadly, a kind of ordinary, very normalized experience for a lot of people, especially on social media. So I just have a few questions then for you, and we can kind of then move to a general conversation. One, of course, which you touch on at various moments, is the power of media and technology, right? Now, of course, we think of media as, in a sense, contributing to a kind of siloed, isolated world, despite its early origins. But there are lots of moments in a hyper-connected world in which media does some of the work that you talked about, overcome that sense of loneliness and this kind of in-group fetishism, I'm going to call it that. I mean, COVID was a moment in which people then, in the isolation of their own flats and houses, in a sense, looked to connect with various people and did that kind of conversation and communication and solidarity in the name of just reaching out for interpersonal contact. So COVID, I think, was a moment in which a lot of things you talked about should be in place, actually, for many people did. One was another kind of very small anecdote when Tim and I were running this Europe in a Wider World project a few years ago, in which we were looking at top 5 countries, the so-called citrus countries, China, India, Turkey, Russia, and the United States, how they looked at Europe. And we had then students and faculty across 16 time zones having the kind of simultaneous experience over webinars. And one of the things that happened there was, in a sense, this experience of exchange and interpersonal relations. And again, built across the internet, was quite remarkable in a sense that becomes a kind of modern version of an 18th century salon, in terms of we had a number of students discussing a particular theme or focal point, and actually were enacting many of the things that you were talking about with this idea of understanding and listening to how these particular 5 select countries understood Europe, with a special interest in thinking about the perspective of young people. So I think actually that worked quite well. And we were very insistent, for example, in keeping the Russian voices in the electronic virtual room, in a sense, keep them part of the broader dialogue, in a sense, to keep that sense of camaraderie with people that I think some people on the call or some people involved in the project felt a little bit uncomfortable, but it was very much a way of making them part of this much larger international discussion about how we talk about the ideas of democracy, Europe, et cetera. I think that was an important point of what you're trying to say, where it's conversation is an effort of kind of democracy learning by doing, like almost a kind of Montessori model doing it as opposed to just talking about it, which I found important, and do so when possible in a kind of face-to-face context. I don't know if you saw today's Guardian, for example. There was a piece on half of the people polled by British Standards Institute, between 16 and 21-year-olds, actually supported the idea of a digital curfew. And 70% said that they actually felt worse with more time they spent online. So I think among younger people, and this is an important story, I think, for political authorities, there's already a sense about the limitations and the blowback. What was seen as a kind of world of instant communication and solidarities turned into something else where I think we have a number of young people that are actually then rebelling against what they feel to be the kind of false promises of a world that's in their pocket with their smartphones. I thought there was actually quite an indication that there's a feeling, a popular groundswell about the limitations of the things you say that are isolating people. Second one, which I can't help but ask, given my profession, is in a sense the role of history. Do you think in this, what do they look at? Is history a source of inspiration, or in a sense does it drive even more pessimism? I've tried to, in a sense, resuscitate a few alternative traditions to say, in fact, that the importance of conversation, let's say with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, there are moments in which this idea of kind of face-to-face encounter, or in a sense, a world of republic of letters in which people are connected across continents, can build a better sense of mutual sympathy, interest in other people, and overcome the strangeness of strangers. I think that's actually quite important. So that's, in a sense, what do you think then, not just in terms of the past, but you talk about the idea of the future. What's the relationship between the future and the role of conversation? Because you're suggesting at various times that the foreclosing of the horizon of the future seems to then vitiate the power and the presence of conversation itself. That with the future dropping off as a place of at least utopian interest, it seems to curtail in a sense, the content and the drive of conversation and mutual learning. So maybe you can think a little bit about that. And then, of course, you said at one point the importance of the relationship between rights and responsibilities. I mean, that's classic Gandhi, of course, that we need to return to a world of duties, of responsibilities, that the world of rights is one in which you're asking the state or the political authorities to do things for you, as opposed to you beginning with you and your own sense of responsibility and duties toward others, toward a sense of society. So I'm just wondering, is this in partly an effort to rehabilitate the importance of responsibility over the obsession with rights, which has characterized much of the 20th century and beyond, which is, I think, quite a strong claim, but it's very much in line with a much longer tradition of a kind of moral politics of Gandhi and others. So I think that's worth thinking about. And the last one is, in a sense, what do you see as the engines of this change? You have this institute in Istanbul, of course. Is it education, you think, is in a sense plays the primary role as a kind of significant force? Or do you think we could find this elsewhere? I mean, media, as we know, technology, again, a space for a range of different reasons, but are you putting a lot of store then in the world of education, is in a sense driving the kinds of conversation you talked about? And the implication is that education at every level is not doing its job in the way that it might have done earlier. So with that, I mean, I think you're called to help us become better peers, better citizens, better people. I think it's all very, very important. And I also believe in the power of listening. And thank you very much for starting this, and hopefully then we can turn to others for a broader conversation.
Hakan, would you like to respond briefly to both four questions, and then we'll get into
Sure,
it.
absolutely. All of them are very interesting. I'll do a selective one. I mean, I thank you for picking up on Gandhi and responsibility. It's a issue that's very dear to me. It also features prominently in Atatürk. His description is free and responsible citizens are the founders and owners of the republic. Responsible because free, but also free because responsible, right? So it's sort of a locking in, and I'm too sad that this responsible part has been pasteurized out of our language. At the school that I mentioned, somewhere in mid-program, we asked the participants, so you've been here, by the way, free of charge, and do you think it's a right to be here or it's a privilege to be here? They're all very opinionated participants, and suddenly there is this silence. And we say, regardless of whether it's a right or a privilege, does it come with any responsibility? Again, a deep silence. And we say, look, your responsibility is not to us. So we're not trying to make you feel indebted to us. But how is it that we don't talk about responsibilities? That Barber used to describe republics and democracies as aristocracy of everyone. Initially understood as giving privilege to larger and larger circles, but I think he meant giving responsibility to larger and larger. So we can't just be interested about rights and being free riders on responsibility. I think we have to be very courageous about talking responsibility. And responsibility is not duty. It's a derivative of response. I'm responsible to you. I'm accountable to you. And that's how we form the intersubjective circle. So Tagore and his show me someone planting a tree, I'll show you someone who knows something about humanity. The phrase that if all people plant trees whose shades they know they will not sleep under, then we are a decent society. I think gets it precisely because we clearly slept under trees that we didn't plant. We don't pay our debt back to them, we paid for it. And we are glad to be doing this. Responsibility is not a chore. It is what sets us free. And we remain free by serving each other, right? And we can't give up on this. And to me, it's part and parcel of camaraderie. Role of history, I absolutely see it as an asset. And as long as we can take it out of this, there is no alternative. It's exactly where we had to be. And so good history, and good history that I learned from my life.
I learned from us.
Gives us that nuance. The role not taken has to be part of this narrative all the time. Now you talked about coffee houses as sites of conversation. Hande and Asloja teaches about coffee houses as part of their course here, and I've learned from them that coffee was also consumed by Jewish mystics so that they can meditate longer into the day, into the night, right? So you talked about atrophy. The thing that has atrophy is our curiosity. So if we can sustain that curiosity, we are constantly bombarded with stimulus. So we want opt-outs. And Simone Weil, attention is the rarest and purest gift that you can give to someone. So my ask would be to have temporary places where we get a taste of this. Our program is only for 8 days, but it's described as a life-changing event by 40% of our participants, only for 8 days. Maybe we can't run all of life like this, but we can give people some brief time out where they try this. What they do with this realization, with this feeling, is up to them. But I think it is irresponsible of us not to provide them this opportunity. Now, you asked about sites for further action, and my son is here, and his headmaster is here. And Mr. Atkins, he runs an extraordinary school where all the stuff that we talked about is actually realized. And he knows, so I don't mind telling him that I have tremendous respect what he and his staff does. In sort of, it's a microcosm of the world we want. Right? and I think, or Rebecca is here, and she did listening exchanges in Oxford. So I think sort of in wonderful but spread out way, we have these bubbles. I think what needs to happen is for us to take this stuff seriously, not as an afterthought, but as part and parcel of first order principles. And if I, for example, sometimes we call it better conversations, more encounters, better conversations. And if I add India, for example, a very haphazard list comes up. But if I did human rights in India, a great list would come up, right? So why is our understanding of this topography so sparse? And so my ask would be to take this seriously, congratulate the people who do it well, try to learn from them, and feel our way forward.
Thank you very much, Hakan. It's very refreshing. We spend most of our time in this room talking about systems, about structures, about processes, about states, about economies, and to have the focus on individual behaviors, to hear the word virtue mentioned several times, and to talk about education is very refreshing. I have quite a few questions. I'm going to restrain myself. Hakan said that if you want to have a difficult conversation, you have to have 3 positive messages before you disagree with him. But I'm going to assume that we've already had the 3 positive messages, so let's go straight to disagreeing. Sonia, off on.
Oh, great. Oh, I get to start things up. Hakan, thank you very much for the presentation. Really stimulating, very wide-ranging, and made me think a lot. And we opened the conversation with a remark about gender. So I'm going to wear the gender hat at the moment and ask a question about gender in the current moment. So some work out of Stanford and the political polarization lab there has found that dating across political lines is now seen as even more invirtuous or more immoral than dating across racial lines, for example.
Interesting.
So parents now are more concerned about their eventually partnering with someone from the other party. And we're also seeing now among young generations that women are increasingly much further left and young men are becoming much further right. And many people are worried, especially with dating apps where you can filter and say, like, I don't want any Republicans, that essentially now we're like intentionally degrading heterosexual relationships and like not to spin this so out of control, but like we're babies. And to points about conversation in South Korea, there's been some research that women, there's a whole movement there that women are swearing off heterosexual relationships and engaging with men. And in the US, there's this like growing rise of the manosphere where there are young men who just enter into male-only spaces to like talk about how much they hate women to one another. So this is all like very terrible news that I'm sharing. Maybe not new, but I am wondering, like, how do you make sense of this current phenomenon and the gendered splintering that's happening? Is listening the salve? And if listening is the salve, what kind of onus does that place given the different power relationships that are kind of embedded in here? Like, is it incumbent upon women to share more for men and men need to listen to them? Is that just the answer? And I guess maybe the cynical phrase would be like, in South Korea, are women wrong to basically just say, I'm not going to engage in men until something changes?
Okay, you want to take that?
No.
It's very explicit.
No, it's very interesting. And I mean, of course, I don't presume to say South African women are wrong. But two books, Jonathan Haid's Righteous Minds and Banerjee, Ashir Banerjee, The Blind Spots. One is, why do the subtitles are why do good people disagree on religion and politics? And the second one is the hidden bias of good people. In both cases, I really adore the fact that both writers chose good in the subtitle, because I think we give up on each other too quickly. We have to persevere a little. One way of describing listening is listening generously, right? I'm partial towards that use rather than active listening, deep listening. I think it's generous listening, right? Can I give you the benefit of the doubt? Um, um, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt. I don't want this to be a sort of a risk thing. And so, can we find out from the South Korean women and everyone else what exactly they're complaining about? I don't feel I have even started this, so this is why I wouldn't presume to answer it. But I'm like the proverbial Mark Twain character with the hammer. I see nails everywhere. I see occasions for listening better and better conversations, and it's partly because of the school. It attracts the participants from an extremely diverse background. I mean, more diverse than it would be legitimate, maybe even legal in Western Europe. We have, hardline racists, hardline Islamists in the same room with LGBTI activists. And they become friends quickly. And they learn how to listen to each other, and they get a taste for this. I mean, it's not a burden. They actually want to hear more from each other. It is possible to choreograph this, and before I pass judgment on anyone, I want to listen generously and long, and I don't want to give up on anyone. Does that make sense?
Awesome.
Thanks, Tim. Now, Hakan, thank you so much. And all that you say is just so credible because it ties so well with your very nice and wonderful soft character. Thank you for this. And very nice points by Paul as well. Now, I wanted to, I just remembered while you were speaking that when Georgi Kosmodinov, the Bulgarian author, was here, he did say that conversation also makes you live longer, which is a very nice thing to have in mind, because it's also about good health. I had 2 points to ask you. The first one is, how do you make this conversation in a world of polarization and echo chambers? In other words, do you speak to the people that you will end up disagreeing, agreeing, or do you engage with others as well that you know that they are really in the other end of the spectrum in terms of the ideas? That's my one question. The other one has to do with the notion of transactionalism that we spoke. If we want to deconstruct this term and think of transactionalism as a conversation, a form of conversation, okay? Is it that bad? I mean, we do connect it so much with Trump that it is very much connected with power and transaction. But transaction is also a form of getting into a deal in a world of different agendas, which then you believe that this is going to take place because you trust the system somehow. So is transaction that bad?
Echo chambers and polarization, and do we talk to our opponents? I would say absolutely yes. In fact, we start talking to them. And in this school that we run, I have a particular rhythm. I have my first meals with the people who think I'm furthest away from. Okay, so to establish that you have access, we try to make everyone feel equally respected and equally heard. And I voted for several different political parties in Turkey. There is one that is left that I haven't voted for, and when there are representatives from that party, I tell them the cases where they were right and I was wrong, and to signal that this is not. I'm not here to score points. I want to make myself vulnerable because I trust in the basic. Our basic humanity. That in the introductions we do the first day, we tell them, yeah, you can talk about your wonderful schools or your wonderful jobs, but tell us one thing that only your best friend knows and no one else does. Again, the point is to make yourself vulnerable and to see that people don't take advantage of this. And we start. So we make fun of ourselves as the presumed authorities in the room. So we have to talk. And I sometimes ask myself, is there any group that I wouldn't talk to? And the list is not very long. It's rather short. Is transactionalism so bad? If that's the only game in town, yes. But hopefully it's not the only game in town. I mean, I sort of skipped if some parts of the paper and as Paul talked about it, play and also gifts, for example, gift giving, very universal, right? And it's the opposite of transactionalism. Why do we give gifts?
Unless it's an aeroplane from Qatar.
No one has offered me an airplane outside my life role. And I think we give gifts, and we of course expect some return gifts, but you give it without a guarantee that you will receive the gift back. I think it's a signal that this is not a narrowly transactional relationship. I'm okay with, and I'm okay with this. That's the signal. And in the long run, transactionalism is not as rational as it claims to be, right? Because again, in the interest of trying to skip a little too fast to Robert Axelrod's work, I mean, he comes to generosity in the second book he writes, when he needs to solve the problem of miscommunication. So start with decency, reciprocate your opponent's move, but every so often I may mislead your intentions and it may attribute malign intent to you, right? So how do we solve this turning into a blood feud that will go on for 5 centuries? The answer is generosity, right? Don't take offense too quickly. And because once you start this vicious circle of a blood feud, you may end up in a place that is far, far worse than your generosity being an over-generous move that will take advantage of. So, like the enlightened emperor, it always looks good on paper, but every so often those emperors end up being bad emperors, and so all these sort of expediencies that you want to reap benefits of are no longer there. So transactionalism is not, I would say, as rational as it seems on paper. At the same time, our, let's say, more progressive friends have to understand that we have acted as if all change is good and all progress is good. But if the change is too quick, if tomorrow is not going to look like today, then my incentives for sticking to rules today decreases. Okay? So if there are pockets in society who don't mind the direction of change, but they mind the speed of change, they may actually be doing something silly. And on this, I believe we have too little patience and certain blind spots. You may recall the Gillian Duffy, the nice lady that met Gordon Brown on the street, and then she was called a bigoted lady. I find her in this. I'm on her side, and she had completely legitimate points of view. She didn't object to direction of change. She objected to speed of change, and shame on Gordon Brown for not seeing this. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Hakan, as always, hearing you, listening to you is really a pleasure. It's inspiring and it makes one's mind open up and think. And I think, I completely agree with your diagnosis of the problem. I think we should focus on fraternity more. It's really something we lack. And listening is a core component of this building of the fraternity. But I want to problematize the very point Gordon Ash made about the level at which we're talking about the problem. I mean, the individual level. For example, for listening, you brought in yourself the importance of education and how great the school was in educating. I totally agree. For example, I think that a humanities education or an education in literature, I mean, I just think of it myself. I mean, when I listen, really listen the way you want us to do to people to understand and exchange and converse, I think all those skills came to me from the kind of literary education, focus on words and implications of these words. But why not? I mean, all the humanities courses are being eroded. Education is becoming, poorer and poorer and more technical and technologically biased and more restricted, emphasis on science and technology rather than science. I mean, all this depends on, at one level, on the political. We brought in the historical. I want to bring in the political. I mean, we are the ones who are bringing in these governments who cut these funds more and more. I mean, do we have a solution to this issue, to building trust via listening, without the political that, basically defines it all? I just want to push it to focus on the political, not forget your own history in the political.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, well, first, in the interest of disclosure, I've been a student of Moja for 38 years, so we go back a long time. 2/3 of the stuff that I talk about here are things that I've learned from her. Of course, I'm partial towards humanities. I was a beneficiary of Humanities 101 at Boğaziçi University. Bildung is a word that is translated either as culture or education into English. I think
It doesn't exist.
exactly. It's a terrible translation. Bildung is something else. It's liberal arts, and it's for our part of the world, it's sort of edep and terbiye and dharma and ren and so these most crucial words are impossible to translate. Of course, it's central, but I don't think it's the only way to get there. It's really lucky of us to have had this, but our participants at the school that are from really that are in places where Bildung won't make sense in a diameter of 1,100 kilometers, still can climatize to the environment if it is provided. We do our trainings if it is provided. Yeah, okay. So, but even if it's provided in a sort of a short time, and for example, if you ask people when was the last time you were really heard, everyone's eyes lit up because they know, they remember. Right? This is a visceral knowledge, and once you capture them with this, and then you start talking about what was it specific, what was special about that instance. Would you not like to provide others with the same? So. I don't think we will need to wait for every Turk to attend Boğaziçi University and receive a BA. And I think there must be faster ways of inoculating them with this realization. It is possible. Again, talking about going back to Paul's question about education. Ege reads his books by Phil and Jim on sort of Mr. Adventure and Mr. Bum, and I want to see one on Mr. Good or Ms. Good Listener. These are short books, and it introduces the vocabulary of it. He has the feeling, and then he gets the name for it. Then they match, and then he recognizes this in the future. So we don't need to wait till everyone becomes 18 and takes a humanities course. I think.
Well, can I follow up on that? Because that was
Absolutely.
precisely my thought, which is it's all very fine us doing things at universities, but you've got to get them young. I mean, it's at the moment they get their first
Right.
this, you have to have this education. And I want the Hakan program, and maybe the headmaster would like to come in on this too, for primary school, because I think it's ridiculous that we don't have mandatory classes in digital literacy from the very first years of school, so that you have, as it were, food labeling for content. You can understand what is factual and what is not factual, what a source is, how you cope with people who are rude, abusive, manipulative, and worse. That's point number 2. Point number 3, teaching listening well. How do you teach listening well? This is my program, but I want the Hakan program. Point number 4, Justin Welby, the recently retired, somewhat involuntarily retired Archbishop of Canterbury, used to talk about disagreeing well. How do we disagree well? And that is something that has to be taught. It's a technique. Gandhi has a wonderful phrase which I love. He says we need speech that opens ears. There's speech that closes ears and speech that opens ears. And an important part of it, I can't emphasize this too much, is humor. Humor is such a wonderful opener of ears and hearts. Amos Oz, the Israeli author, said, I have never met a fanatic who had a sense of humor, or someone who had a sense of humor who was a fanatic. And so he wanted to distribute humor pills around the Middle East to treat the fanaticism. So, but I really think, I mean, seriously, I think this would be a great place to take this, would be at the level of the primary school. What's in the Hakan program? Would the headmaster like to comment on that? It's a school.
Tell us your magic, Mr. Elkins.
I mean, first of all, do you have classes on this kind of thing quite early on?
So thank you very much for inviting me, by the way, and you've complimented me twice now, so I'm bracing myself for the third one, because I know the difficult conversation is coming after that. As part of the primary school curriculum in this country, we teach social, personal, health education. So we and through, for example, lessons like RE, we teach children facts and about other religions and faiths and that sort of thing in a hope that we breed tolerance. I think that a lot of the things that you've touched upon today, generous listening is something I'm going to take away and think about quite a lot. Can't be taught in a half-hour a week or something like that. I think they have to be taught as part of a child's everyday lived experience, and that comes down to the values and the ethos of the place where people spend their time. Community is one of our core values at school. We serve a really diverse community. We have, less than half the children are British. I think last count we have about 33 first languages spoken. And so community is massively important to us. We lack some of the things that other schools use to unite them. So, for example, we don't have a school uniform, which makes us quite unusual. So the way that we conduct ourselves, the way that we encourage children to conduct themselves through all of our interactions, I think, become very, very important. And that trickles all the way through from me, I suppose, as a school leader, right down to our ground staff, but most importantly, the children. So we work with them all the time on trying to develop a better understanding. So when children disagree, we work with them to try to develop an empathy for the other person. So I guess to answer your question, I think that a Hakan curriculum would be great. I don't think, though, it could be developed to be delivered in a half-hour a week. I think what we need to do is we need to work with everybody within the establishment. So this is how we're going to conduct ourselves, not just as teachers or children, but as people. And I don't know how you make that work, but I'd love to see how.
It's so fascinating. I'm really grateful. 33 first languages is remarkable. Just a quick follow-up on, if I may. Do you have any education in digital literacy in a much more narrow sense, being able to discriminate between the kinds of content that is coming?
Yeah, so the pace of change in technology is so rapid at the moment. Our last national curriculum came in 6 or 7 years ago now. We do teach digital literacy. So we, as part of that, children are taught to try to think critically about information that they're presented with. My daughter is a great example of this. She's 17. She's completely addicted to her phone. When she was a bit younger, she came up to me very excited one day, saying, "Leave it. This player's about to sign for Arsenal, football team we support." And I looked at it, and it was a report from about 6 years before. But she just wasn't thinking. And so we do teach children to think critically about the issue that they find. Our parent body have some really strong held views about the role, particularly of technology in education. Screens, that sort of thing, and there's a sort of voluntary body of parents who start to get together to help and support each other to dissuade their children from having smartphones, for example. It's difficult for us to take a line on that, but certainly I do think it's really important that we educate children not only how to use technology, but also how to use it safely, responsibly, and that's something that we do at a young stage. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to ask Eddie for his great How can we given you time to come up with a Hakan comment on this?
I think Mr. Atkins is being too modest. I think, of course, it's precisely right that it's the ethos and it's everybody. The core values are community care and compassion, and they embody this. And through osmosis, this trickles out. So I think they get the experience of this, and then maybe the words would come, and then it's an iterative process. We will be at school.
You mean your school?
At our school, at the European School of Politics, we are asking ourselves this: how can we advocate, describe, narrate, tell the history of these values better and beyond the whatever hundreds or thousands people that we encounter through our work. You may have noticed that Yuval Harari, this popular historian, is now writing children's and with illustrations and good for him. And we should do the same. And
There's more money.
There's something fine. To make money. They should make money. I mean, if it's going to make money, let children writers make money. I mean, rather than bankers. and what did they ever do for us? Apart from, spoil.
Respect for that.
Who was it that said, the last thing they did for that served the public was the ATM. Everything else has been working for them. And so I can't justify their extraordinary pays. Going back to camaraderie and fraternity, it's the economy that works for the society. Society doesn't work for the economy. Perfectly legitimate for a society to decide the level of taxation and what it wants to do when it grows up. And it's shame on us for not having this and thinking that somehow economics is the independent variable. It's not. We decide. And I think we need to be crystal clear about this. And then we can have the what sort of younger generations we want discussion as well. So,
By the way, there's a terrific technique I've seen in action at a school in Oxford called constructive controversy. Have you come across this? So what happens is you take a few issues on which the kids might have different views, ask them what their views are, and then you get them to argue the opposite case against each other. And I've seen it in action. And it's an absolute light bulb moment. They say, yes, someone could actually have the opposite point of view, but we could disagree. So that's a great one. I'm going to take a last round, I think. So I've got Dimo, I've got David. Would anyone else like to come in? I'm looking deep. Yes, and the gentleman at the back there. Fantastic. Dimo?
Yeah, great, enriching talk, Hakan. So much to comment on. One tiny remark and then a question. And the remark is in this meta narrative. You mentioned Adam Smith, and I think it's a bit of a caricatured image of Smith we collectively are taking. And I remember reading Amartya Sen take on Smith, reminded us that he's a moral philosopher. First and foremost, he's not the prequel to Milton Friedman, but people read the Stalin's version.
Yeah.
But that's beside the point. My real point is echoing your opener about somewhere versus nowhere. I have a similar question, predictably enough, and it's about Turkey. To shift the conversation on this kind of cosmopolitan and ethical issues to a bit more the meat of the matter. And one thing that's always struck me in Turkey, it's a very polarized place, right? We know the story, but anecdotally, when you move around, maybe as a male, you cannot be not impressed by the sociability of the place. There's certain ways to navigate. Their languages of sociability, which transcends, as you rightly point in your example about the school, the barriers divide by Turkish society. So I'll be curious to get your reflections of this social cement. To what extent it's still there, how it works, how I can use it productively. Of course, you gave us some flavor based on the school. But yeah, I'm just narrowing down this global conversation into a conversation about a certain place, which is so very diverse. It will be very interesting. Thank you.
David?
Hakan, thank you very much indeed. How have you retained your faith in sort of confederation and people understanding each other in today's world, and given your own background as a prisoner?
Thank you for the conversation. So my question is, in today's world, where AI-generated misinformation and disinformation are everywhere, and our very ability to listen and to communicate is under threat from algorithmic bias, deepfake, and echo chamber that keep reinforcing the same viewpoint. So my question is that how can we tell AI-created content apart from genuine human speech? And what practice or mindset can help us ensure that we are truly hearing voice of value, not just cleverly crafted things? Yeah, thank you.
And what I'm going to do, I think, is to come back to Paul for any comments and then come to Hakan afterwards. Cool.
I'm not going to answer that. I'm just going to make one kind of last reflection, really, which goes back to your idea of fraternity. I mean, of course, that can cut in lots of different directions. I mean, fraternity or sorority, it's a kind of in-group terms, and that can be based on as much exclusion as it is inclusion. And the only way I think you go forward with that, of course, is if it's undergirded by a sense of humanity, which is obviously an important term. I mean, in the Eurocentric view, that's a kind of another Enlightenment term, kind of a secular idea of humanity that at least has a kind of will to kind of universalism. I mean, we know how that particular project gets inflected with class and race along the way, but at least in its kind of 18th century model, it seems to be quite important. The one thing I would say, concept I think, which is the foundation of all of this, it's not so much fraternity, it's the concept you use, which is the term of empathy. I think empathy is the beginning of interest in other people. It's the beginning of sympathizing with other people's conditions. And that seems in the beginning of mutual knowledge, mutual understanding. And that seems to be what you're teaching at school. And I think the origins of civil society is something we're talking about that begins in primary school. But I think it's, in a sense, it's kind of philosophy, kind of radical empathy, that is the very, very beginning and the mission of this kind of interpersonal relations. And without that, then in a sense, it becomes a kind of truncated, atrophied, isolated world, which you're talking about. So it's kind of called for, in a sense, a kind of different sensibility just toward different people and strangers. And I think it's very, very important to use this particular room in a sense to talk about that as, in a sense, our way forward as it's an important, it's a moral call to, in a sense, reinvent a sense of community around something simple, but it's unusual as mutual respect for different people.
Just passing it back to you, Hakan, I think some people would feel we've had quite a sort of, I'm not going to say idealized conversation here, but setting the bar very high. And it occurs to me as we're speaking, and particularly from what Paul said, that one word I don't think we've mentioned more than a couple of times is tolerance. The classic liberal virtue is tolerance, which actually is setting the bar lower. It's not that I have full empathy with your position, but we coexist in the same space. So I wonder if in responding to all those very interesting questions, you could also address the question of tolerance. Okay.
You're absolutely right. In-group, out-group competition is real as everything else that we talked about. But again, as good historians, I think we can always find the sort of Bartolomeos de las Casas, all of and Tim, in a previous meeting that I think all three of us were, the Enlightenment against Empire business. I mean, there was always a more inclusive version of the dominant paradigm, and that process is the more, or instead of disagreeing well, I would say disagree better. Right? Can we do it? So it's a moving yardstick rather than one fixated somewhere. And in today's world, with the rise of the West, I think it's inevitable that we have to have, as you have done with the free speech project and thoughtful people from the global South and their friends as a part of the conversation. Timo's reference to Adam Smith, I hear you, and I hear everyone else who argues the same, but still, for me, the wealth of nations speak louder than theory of moral sentiments. Once you say you should get your supper by appealing to the self-interest of the grocer and the butcher and not to their compassion, it is difficult to take this back. So I think Adam Smith obviously is more complicated than the standard story makes him to be, but he did lend himself to this interpretation. And at a time when he was living with people like Thomas Paine, which told a different story. So I want to retain the difference between Adam Smith and Thomas Paine. On Turkey and the cements, the social cements, is, you're absolutely right. It is there, and I think we have lived this at the school that Turks, at least not yet, have not given up on each other. If you lift the barriers, they would take a genuine interest in each other, would be curious, and would talk. We have people that you would never think would do things together, writing books, doing joint projects. And I would argue that in the US, polarization is real and Trump is the consequence. I think it is a little different in Turkey, where someone wants to benefit from polarization and has an instrumental approach to polarization. And this, I'll jump to David's point of whether he was too polite to ask it this way, but did the time in prison do anything to these views? And I would say they strengthened it, as strangely as it is. I had a sense that, decency and virtue of ordinary people was real, but I now feel I have proof, because we were on the receiving end of so much solidarity, from ordinary people to very senior people, from the wrong side of the political spectrum as well. And our alumni from both the Nationalist Party and Erdogan's party went on the record to oppose my conviction, which was no small feat, since these are not very open-minded political families and don't take dissent of this kind lightly. I went to a kindergarten, and we had other friends with kindergarten age children. They're the owners of these kindergartens refused to accept payment. We had two former lawyers. Thank you, Antony. Turkey has a large number of very dedicated lawyers who work very hard day in and day out, refuse payment. And the shopkeepers that Hande Ege stopped by when they were leaving the weekly visits, and the extraordinary kindness that they had towards the prison guards. Ege doesn't remember that place as a negative place, because everyone was nice to them. A completely untold story. And I'm convinced that there are very many more decent people than there are indecent people. Now, indecent ones happen to be better organized than us, but maybe that's a good thing, because if we had a monopoly on decency, I don't think that would be a very pleasant world. Hiroki-san, I don't know about AI. I'm just getting started, and it goes above my head, and I'm hoping that it will be like Google, and we'll all get used to how to use it. So taking baby steps. So I will defer to you on how to know the difference between deep fake and real human communication. And I used to be able to say, if Harari is right and that cooperation is what makes us great, then judging sincerity is our great faculty. And this is why we didn't quite know why we shouldn't trust Kerry, but I think we were right not to trust John Kerry. And we couldn't formulate it. But as you know, deep fake is very capable, and I don't know whether we have the skills to sense the artificialness in this. But I might rather defer to you and other smart people than try to figure this out on my own.
But I certainly think we have the sense to feel the authenticity of what Hakan has been saying for the last hour and 3/4. I want to start by congratulating Eggy, who has been amazingly quiet for an hour and 3/4. A round of applause. Garton would have said that for 30 minutes. Second of all, I can't help saying that the thought that has been running through my mind for this entire seminar is if only an undecent person called Donald Trump could have been sent to Hakan's school and then you kept him there, the world would be a much better place. But more seriously, this was called the magic of conversation. And I think in a curious way, this has been rather a magical conversation, very different from the ones we normally have in this room, in many ways very inspiring, optimistic, full of wonderful phrases. I love the phrase an aristocracy of everyone. I shall use that one. And so I hope you will develop the Hakan curriculum for all schools everywhere. But meanwhile, please join me in thanking Hakan and Paul for the conference.